Dude, we are going to energise the country.
Stop Brexit.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. I'm joined by my co-host, Conrad.
Hello.
And in this episode, we're delighted to be joined by Julian Burnside QC, who is a leading Australian human rights activist and is also the Greens candidate for the federal Senate seat of Victoria. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So the first question that I'd like to ask is, what first got you involved in the Greens, and what first made you decide to stand as a senatorial candidate for Victoria?
Okay, if I could be allowed a longish answer,
Yeah.
I grew up in a country where the Liberal Party was in government from the year of my birth to the year I graduated from university. I was totally not interested in politics or politicians. I despised most of them. But at the end of 2018, I think it was, the IPCC produced a report which said in substance that the world has to take urgent steps in relation to climate change by 2030 or it will be too late. And the idea that it would be too late really hit home. And I thought, well, the only party in Australia with a sensible approach to climate change is the Greens. I had a look at the rest of their policies. They all ultimately resolved to a concern about human rights, and I was sold because human rights and justice are a major part of my thinking.
So you obviously ran against the current Treasurer of Australia. What was it like running against someone who's sort of a high-profile figure? Did it make the race sort of interesting, get more media attention?
Well, I don't know what sort of media attention I would have expected in a different seat. One thing I should say, I didn't choose to run against him personally. I ran against him in his seat because I've lived in this seat all my life. So I thought, well, I'm not going to move, so I might as well stand in this seat. And to be candid, I always thought Josh Frydenberg was a fairly decent guy. But very quickly, he was being so dishonest, I thought, he's not a decent guy after all, he's a prick. I mean, one thing, for instance, he and a Liberal candidate in the seat next door to this put forward the view that I was in favour of female genital mutilation. That was by reference to a speech I'd given to the Medico-Legal Society of Victoria 25 years ago, in which I said the exact opposite, that I was appalled by female genital mutilation and totally opposed to it. And the real question, the philosophical question I was debating was whether the fact that you disapprove of something means that you should make it unlawful. And they're very different things. So I said, well, you don't make FGM unlawful, no matter that I disapprove of it profoundly. That point seems to have missed him completely. And I thought it was pretty unscrupulous for him to suggest that I was in favour of FGM when in fact I'm opposed to it, and said so in plain terms in the paper, which obviously he didn't read. And that's one of the reasons that I've always disliked politicians, because honesty seems to be alien to what they do. And to be candid, if I get into Parliament, I will be honest at all times, and I'll call out other people's dishonesty if I see it.
One of the things that I found particularly interesting with the things that you have focused on is that, and you mentioned this in a video that you did for the Greens at the federal elections, is that you said that you were concerned about how individuals are treated. Do you think that sometimes in the political system, individuals are overlooked?
I do. And when you think about it, human rights is ultimately a question of how individual people are treated. I think it's really important And the best I can say of myself is that I don't think my human rights have ever been significantly at risk, but I'm very concerned about other people whose human rights are at risk. So individual people always count.
Now, obviously the biggest news story at the moment, the one we can't get away from, is the coronavirus outbreak. The Australian government has been seen by a lot of people to have handled it pretty well. What's your thoughts on how they've handled it? Do you think they've done it well, or do you think there's areas that could improve?
I think they've handled it very well, actually. Much as I dislike our present Liberal government, I think they've done a very good job of it. I'm concerned about the fact that the method of defeating the coronavirus in Australia has involved trashing some basic liberties, but when you are fighting a really dangerous opponent, then some liberties have to be compromised. The real test for this government will be what they do when the pandemic is ended. And if they continue to keep the measures that so affect individual liberties, then I'll be deeply concerned about that, and I'll be standing up and opposing it.
Now, one of the other major news stories in the last few years in Australia has, of course, been the refugees on Manus and Naru who've been detained there. I wondered, if you are elected to the Senate, what will you be doing in regards to the case of Manus and Naru? What do you think should be done with the people who are still on Manus and Naru?
Well, in my opinion, they should be brought to Australia and allowed to live in the community, and at an appropriate time be allowed to apply for citizenship. There's a great... I got involved in the refugee issue because of the Tampa case, which was... the Tampa was a Norwegian cargo ship which was asked by the Australian government to go to the rescue of some people in a refugee boat, which the Australian government was aware of. That refugee boat had run into physical difficulties. It had basically fallen apart and all the refugees were in the water. The captain of the Tampa later said he'd thought there were maybe 50 people on the boat, and he was astounded when 438 people walked up the rope ladder onto the deck of the Tampa. Now, the people on the deck of the Tampa were in a pretty difficult position, and I was asked to act for them pro bono by a solicitor who had recently briefed me in a case concerning a fugitive Mexican banker. And I said yes, not because of any interest in refugees or concern about refugees, because I knew nothing about refugees back then. But ever since childhood, I've suffered from the heat very much. And I thought, these poor buggers, they're sitting on the steel deck of a ship in the tropical sun. That must be dreadful. We've got to do something to help them. So that's how I got into it. Now, by getting into that case, I came across a lot of people who knew a great deal about refugees, and I learned a lot about what was going on, not least of which that refugees who arrived in Australia without prior permission would be locked up until they received a visa or until they were removed from Australia. Pretty dreadful when you think about it. The Tampa case ran for, I think, 6 days. And the judgment, which was in our favour from the trial judge, was handed down in Melbourne at 2:15 in the afternoon Melbourne time on the 11th of September 2001. About 8 hours later, the attack on America happened. And all of a sudden, the then Prime Minister of Australia started calling boat people illegals because his assumption was that all boat people were Muslim and all Muslims were dreadful. That was the crude logic that he worked on. That case probably changed the direction of my life in a number of ways, not least because I became active in the public, trying to change the public's mind. It also, my wife, who's an artist, said, this is outrageous. You know, most Australian homes have got a spare room, and we should set up spare rooms for refugees. The idea being that you'd use your spare room to give someone free accommodation. And I said, well, if we're going to do that, we have to lead by example. So from late 2001 to the present, we've had refugees living in our house with us. That's been very, very useful, because what that taught me is that just like other people, some refugees are fantastic, most are just ordinary, and some are not great. But it's just like real people, just like the rest of us, you know? And that's a very useful thing to learn. So the Tampa litigation also resulted in the Australian government setting up Manus and Naru as places of offshore detention. There's a bloke in detention in Melbourne at the moment who arrived just after July 2013. As a result, he was sent more or less automatically to Manus, being an unaccompanied male. He was recognised by the Papua New Guineans as a refugee, and he started suffering medical problems which the PNG system was incapable of remedying. As a result, he was brought to Australia for medical treatment under what was called the Medivac legislation, which has subsequently been repealed. Anyway, he was brought here about 8 or 10 months ago for specific medical needs. He has not yet received the medical treatment that he was brought here for. He's held in detention, even though he was brought here by Australia and is recognised as a refugee. And he's been told privately that it will be 2022 before he gets the medical treatment that he was sent here for. So, you know, I think the people we've sent to places like Manus and Naru really should be treated decently, like the human beings that they are. We've got people in detention, refugees in detention, who've been in detention for 9 years. Now, that's pretty much the time you'd get in jail if you're convicted of murder. Now, these people haven't committed any offence at all, and yet they are locked up and treated like criminals. And at the moment, there's a very serious problem with coronavirus, because some of them are kept in what's called community detention, which means that they're in the Mantra Hotel in Preston, which is not very far from the main detention centre. And they are held like 4 or 5 people in one room, absolutely rock-solid conditions, the sort of conditions that are very likely to lead to them getting coronavirus, and yet there they are. They've committed no offence. They're held in conditions which will probably produce coronavirus.
So another sort of big issue that you are concerned about, obviously as a Green Party member, is climate change, and Australia has suffered with bushfires this year, becoming a more and more regular occurrence. Now, what kind of green policies would you like to see Australia put into place, and how do these differ to what the government's doing at the moment?
I would like to see the science being taken seriously. At the moment, the government nods to the science and does nothing about it. Clearly, fossil fuel as a source of energy is a major problem, and most of our fossil fuel electricity plants are operating way beneath their capacity and are causing great harm. We need to take climate change seriously. And the thing that worries me about climate change is this. It is something that we've seen. It's something we've seen coming up, and we've done nothing about it. It will lead to a world which is essentially unlivable for human beings. So by the time the present generation of politicians are dead, by the time the next generation of politicians are dead, our grandchildren or great-grandchildren will be inhabiting a planet which is not capable of supporting human life. Now, I think that's outrageous. That is the worst denial of human rights imaginable, and yet we've known about it. I don't know how much you've looked at this subject, but the mechanism of climate change is that infrared radiation is trapped in the atmosphere, especially by carbon-based molecules. I wonder if either of you know when that phenomenon was first identified. It was first identified by an English scientist called Eunice Foote, who helped an Irish scientist called John Tyndall in 1859. We've known about it for over a century and we've done nothing.
Do you think that part of the reason that there are deniers of climate change is that the sheer enormity of the problem is sometimes too difficult for people to rationalise and to engage with?
That's a very interesting question. It may be that, or it may be the same phenomenon that resulted in people paid by the tobacco industry for years and years denying that smoking had an adverse impact on health. Now, I don't know which it is, but it's time for people to wake up and have a look at the science. I mean, most people have got an iPhone. That means that they rely on science. Most people are willing, once the coronavirus thing's out of the way, most people are willing to hop on an aeroplane. That means that they're placing their faith in science. Now, climate change is as dangerous as a plane that crashes. Maybe people should place some reliance on the science in relation to climate change. There's another very interesting thing. There's one of the best books I think I've ever read is called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, an Israeli writer. And it is a history of Homo sapiens, which is our species. We've been around 200,000 or 300,000 years. And until we discovered agriculture, we tended to live in extended groups of 50 or 100 people, moving from hiding place to hiding place, avoiding our predators and so on. Then about 12,000 years ago, we discovered agriculture. And that was the time when we began to live in towns, villages, cities, and so on. And in the book, Harari raises a very interesting question. He says, if we've spent 90% of our history as a species in these extended but modest-sized groups, and only 10% of our history living in towns and villages, does this mean that we are genetically disposed to be concerned about the immediate group rather than the entire group? Now, he doesn't answer the question, but it's a really, really interesting question. And climate change is the very first phenomenon which has threatened our entire species, all of us. So, although there's an interesting irony in this, it occurred to me a while back that if climate change keeps going the way it is, with help of people like Scott Morrison, who notoriously carried a lump of coal into the parliament to praise it and say that it was not dangerous, if climate change keeps going the way he contemplates, then it is a certainty that people like you and me will perish. You know, city life will no longer be livable. There'll be some human survivors like the Kalahari Bushmen, like the Inuit, and like the outback Aborigines in Australia. So if Scott Morrison gets his way, the Aboriginal people of Australia might get their land back, the land that we stole from them in 1788.
Now, Green parties are often seen as being on the left of politics, but recently we've seen in Austria the Green Party form a coalition government with Seb Kurtz's party, which is on the right, and people have spoken about a similar thing maybe happening with Merkel's party in Germany after the next federal election. Do you think that this is sort of something that can happen more and more, and that Green parties could sort of have more of a right-wing alliance, or do you think that the traditional view of Green parties being left-wing is the correct one?
Interesting question, and I think the only truthful answer is I'm not sure. I think that Greens parties are typically oriented to the left, which may make it difficult to form an alliance with a party of the right. But if a Greens party can form an alliance with parties of the right without sacrificing their underlying principles, well, fine, why not? So, in principle, I don't oppose it. In practice, I suspect it's very difficult.
Now, of course, one of the major left-wing parties in Australia is, of course, the Labour Party. And in the last federal elections in which you took part, the Labour Party seemed like they may be able to get a majority, but fell short. Why do you think Bill Shorten didn't live up to the expectations that many people had for him?
The Liberal Party, which succeeded, ran a fairly dishonest campaign, and that's probably part of it. To be candid, I don't mind Bill Shorten as a guy, but I didn't think he was much of a leader. I don't know. I think you'd probably have to speak to a much more sophisticated political analyst than me to get an answer to that.
Now, one issue that's been massive in the UK over recent years is Brexit, Britain leaving the European Union. One element of this is new free trade deals around the world and possibly a free trade deal with Australia. What are your views on Britain and Australia doing a trade deal?
Well, if it's possible, bring it on. I don't have any objection to it on principle. I don't know how practical it is. And I'm not close enough to the Brexit process to have a particular view about Brexit, but I would have thought any countries that can reach an agreement on trade should do so. The only problem that I have with international trade is that it's a very curious thing that goods and money are allowed to move around the globe more or less without hindrance. Why can't people also move around the globe more or less without hindrance?
Now, we've mentioned Brexit and, of course, Britain's relationship with Australia. But another relationship that did develop over the last couple of years was, of course, Australia's relationship with the United States and the relationship between the Prime Minister of Australia and the President of the United States. How do you feel about that relationship between the Australian government and the American President?
Probably the best way to answer that is to say that I regard Donald Trump as the worst leader of a major country that I've ever experienced, and I can't stand Scott Morrison. So what do you want? I mean, I think it's really going to be a problem because in terms of trade, America is relatively unimportant to us. I mean, it's significant, but not a major element. But our biggest trading partner is China. And whilst Australia and America have had a fairly strong relationship in matters of defence for quite a long time, America and China are not getting along well, and that will create stresses for Australia. And I have to say, I think if push comes to shove, I'd be inclined to say let's back China, even though that may weaken our relationship with America.
Now, I'd like to move to some of the cases that you involved in as an advocate. And one of the ones that I think was particularly interesting and was very significant was the Bruce Trevorrow case involving the lost generations of Aborigine people. For those who aren't familiar with the case, can you just explain what it was about and your involvement with it?
Yeah. Bruce Trevorrow was born in November 1956 at 1 Mile Camp, Meningie. Meningie is a very small town on the edge of the Coorong, which is a large body of water where the Murray River enters the ocean. The reason that Bruce was born in 1 Mile Camp, 1 Mile Camp was just a collection of humpies and so on, a mile outside Meningie, and the reason for it was that back then, in November 1956, it was unlawful for an Aboriginal person to be less than 1 mile from a place of white settlement unless they had a permit. pretty shocking idea when you think of it. When you consider that we were on their land, which you took from them, our ancestors took the land from them. So anyway, when Bruce was 13 months old, on Christmas Day of 1957, he got very sick. He was driven up to Adelaide to the Children's Hospital by some people in Meningie who had a car. He was put in hospital, was diagnosed as having gastroenteritis, and there was a wave of gastro going through South Australia at the time. He was treated appropriately, and a week later he was better. And a week after that, he was given away to a white family who lived in suburban Adelaide. It didn't work out so well. The mother, the white so-called foster mother, although he was never actually fostered to them, the white foster mother had some personal difficulties, and Bruce had difficulties. By the time he was 9, he was giving real trouble. He was sent to the then newly established child guidance clinic, and he was treated for the difficulties he was having. When he turned 10, the law had changed so that he was allowed to meet his natural family. Up until then, the government had consistently prevented his natural mother from finding out where he was, so he'd never met his natural mother or his siblings, and he never actually met his father, who died before the law changed. It was arranged that Bruce would spend, I think the following Easter, down at a city about, I don't know, many miles from Adelaide, like maybe 100 miles from Adelaide, Port Augusta. No, not Port Augusta, but anyway, it doesn't matter. He was allowed to go to his natural family for the Easter holiday. A lady from the Aborigines department came round to his house in suburban Adelaide. They put him on the bus, sent him off to wherever it was, and the white mother said, "He's too much trouble, I won't have him back." So the department posted his clothes and his toys after him. That's how he was reunited with the natural family that he'd never known. Now, things didn't work out so very easily there, and he left them and tried to walk back to Adelaide, hundreds of miles. He was picked up by the police and spent the rest of his childhood in state care. Now, that was Bruce. Anyway, Bruce happened to be in Adelaide at one point and walked past the Aboriginal Legal Service, and he wandered in, and they agreed to take up his case and apply to the court for damages that he'd suffered. After a trial that ran for many weeks, we got judgment. The judge found as a fact that he'd been taken unlawfully from his natural family, that he'd suffered damage as a result, and he was awarded almost $1 million in damages. It was a big win, and it is, even to this day, it is the only stolen generation case to have succeeded. The irony of it all is that Bruce had 2 brothers, Tom and George Trevorrow, and Tom and George had become leaders of the Nurringerry community, which is the Aboriginal group in that area. We got the judgment in August of 2007, and later that year, Kevin Rudd became a Labor Prime Minister of Australia. He promised in advance that the first order of business for the new government would be an apology to the stolen generations. But Kevin Rudd, being as he is, wanted to have the public gallery filled with Aboriginal people to listen to the apology. Tom and George Trevorrow were invited. Bruce was not. The only person found by court to have been unlawfully taken from his parents. So we sent the department a little reminder, and he eventually was invited, and he got there and was very, very proud of having got there. But he died in June the following year, June of 2008, just short of his 52nd birthday. So it was a story with some interesting facets.
Do you think that the Australian people and the Australians' government's relationship to the Aborigine people is strained because there hasn't been a full or a complete recognition of what was done by the government to the Aborigine people?
Yeah, I think it has. It's interesting, in Melbourne, where I live, you can hardly go to any public event without the person in charge of the event saying that they acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and the whatever group of the whatever nation, and acknowledge their elders past and present. I was in Bunbury on the west coast of Western Australia a few years ago, and the lady who'd organised the event said that there's going to be the acknowledgement and then this and then that and then you'll speak and so on. And I said, look, if you're going to acknowledge the traditional owners, what about acknowledging that our ancestors took the land from them and caused them immense harm? And then we redoubled the harm by taking their children from them. And Aboriginal people in Australia are now a very sad group, regarded by most Australians as no-hopers. And I think it's time that we looked around and considered the possibility that our actions were part of the cause. Now, what surprised me about it was I think Bunbury was the first time I'd suggested it be done that way. And Bunbury is a very conservative town. The people in Bunbury stood up and applauded when the person running the meeting gave the acknowledgement that way. So I think there are people with good conscience here who haven't yet worked out that we owe a real debt to the people, the Aboriginal people who survive. Interestingly, you may be aware that several governments, recent governments, have adopted the slogan "Stop the Boats" in relation to refugees. I saw a wonderful cartoon a while back. It's a black fella standing at Sydney Cove, looking down at the first fleet lying at anchor in 1788. He's got a can of British paints in one hand, which will make you understand my snide comments, and using the paint he has scrawled on an adjacent surface, "Stop the boats."
We're coming to the end of the podcast now. It's been great to speak to you, Julian, and I've got one final question for you. Of course, you're running in Victoria, you're running as a Greens candidate. I just wondered, as someone who's been a lawyer, whether you're at all worried about someone, say, for example, someone called Cleaver Green standing against you. And I wondered, what do you think of Rake as a television programme, and what do you think of the representation of lawyers, of barristers in media?
I thought Rake was a terrific program. I really enjoyed it. I'm not sure it represents barristers all that accurately. I mean, I know enough barristers to think there are some like Cleaver Green, but it's a great show. It's a great show. And it shows that some lawyers can be entertaining. I mean, the rest of us are pretty dull because, you spend your life doing dull stuff. I've been very lucky in my career because I've done some pretty interesting cases, and Trevorrow is just one of them. But, yeah, I think Rake is a program really worth watching.
I would highly recommend that to any of our listeners to check it out. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you can subscribe to us on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and Podbean. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, you can do @TheDebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast. And if you'd like to email us about this episode or any others that you've listened to, you can do at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.